few short questions, and then I'm going to give you an open-ended question. You said Jesus Christ sacrificed himself. God knew what was going to happen. Jesus, because he was 100% man, 100% God, absolutely knew what was going to happen, why he was walking the earth, and that he was going to be sacrificed on that crucifix, correct? I mean, is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And he did it anyways. He did it anyways to save souls eternally so that we may have everlasting life. Is that correct?
That's correct, exactly.
And he said, no more sacrifices shall be made after this. Didn't he say that?
Well, he said, when he said, as he hung on the cross, that Roman cross, he said, it is finished. And then it says that there was the veil of the temple was ripped from top to bottom. So that was the hand of God or a hand of an angel from the top, ripping it down to the bottom. And that signified that when Jesus died as our great sacrifice, the temple service, the sanctuary, the sacrifices, all of that had come to an end because the great sacrifice had been offered.
So when you're talking about going and finding the perfect cow, this red heifer, and then you're bringing it to Israel where they're being pent up, and now you're going to slaughter this thing and burn it, and all of this stuff sounds very satanic. It sounds like ushering in the Antichrist, and this guy was saying, no, this is biblical. No, my interpretation is that this is exactly opposite of biblical. Pastor, your thoughts?
Yeah, exactly right. See, when he was saying this is, I forgot whether it was the Christian or whether it was the Jew who was making that statement. I think it was the Christian who believes in the Israel-centered eschatology. But when you read the New Testament, it's very clear. Jesus was. Paul says in the book of Hebrews that he offered one sacrifice forever, and as I mentioned, the veil was ripped from top to bottom. Paul said in Corinthians, Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. We can look at some other verses in a little while if you want. There's a number of verses that prophecy-minded Christians use to support their theory that the temple's going to be rebuilt during the 7 years of tribulation. The Antichrist is going to come into the temple and say he's God. There's certain verses that they use, but when you really look carefully at those verses, they're being misquoted. They're being misused. It reminds me of the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness. He was tempted 3 times by the devil. And in the first temptation, Jesus responded to Satan's temptation to make stones into bread. Jesus said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And in the second temptation, it's very interesting. Satan then, because Jesus quoted scripture, Satan quotes scripture. He took him to the top of the temple and he said, it is written, throw yourself down. And he quoted the Psalms, but he was misquoting scripture. And that shows me Satan knows the Bible. He can quote scripture, but he misquotes it. And then Jesus responded and said, it is written again, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. And that principle, the second temptation, is very important because it shows that Satan and people can quote scripture, but they can do it, they can misinterpret and quote it falsely.
Yeah,
and
for
that's
manipulation purposes.
And that's what's happening with this whole. Yes, the whole Scofield Bible. I understand that history from Darby to Scofield to Dallas Theological Seminary to Hal Lindsey to Tim LaHaye, the Left Behind series. This whole monumental eschatology of end time events where you have a rapture, you have 7 years, you have a rebuilt temple, you have an Antichrist who walks into the temple and says he's God, you have a Middle East bloody battle against the Jews. They use scriptures, they do, to support every single point of their theory. But when you really look closely at every single one of these texts, they're being misquoted, just like Satan misquoted scripture to Jesus in the second temptation.
So in other words, this sacrifice of this red heifer, the building or the construction of this temple, the ushering in of, now this guy, this Stinson, Byron Stinson, he's saying that he's fulfilling God's prophecy by doing this, and that he believes that this is going to usher in the second coming of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, that's entirely not true. And if I were to have a dialogue with him, I would ask him, well, show me a Bible verse. And if he did show me a Bible verse, then I would take a look at that verse carefully and say, is this verse saying what you're saying it's saying? And there's a lot of verses. One of the ones is Daniel 9:27. I believe he talked about how the sacrifices must be restarted in order for the sacrifices to cease. And he interpreted that to be the Antichrist doing that. And that's part of their whole structure. But that is a misquote of Daniel 9:27, which we could probably spend 15 minutes on, which is where they get the 70th week of Daniel and they move it down to the end of time. They call it the 7 years of tribulation. It talks about the sacrifices ceasing. So they say they have to be restarted in the Jewish temple during the tribulation. But when you look at that text in its context, the 70th week of Daniel follows the 69th week of Daniel. And if you go back in history, Matthew Henry, his famous commentary, Adam Clark, Jefferson, Fawcett, and Brown, all these great Protestant commentaries, they all interpreted the he who would cause the sacrifice to cease as Jesus Christ, not Antichrist. After 3.5 years of public ministry, in the middle of the 7th week of Daniel, Jesus died on the cross, caused the sacrifices to cease, put an end to the temple and all of its ceremonies. And Christians have now taken that 70th week, disconnected it from the 69 weeks, shoved it down to the end of time, drop it down, call it the 7 years of tribulation, call the Antichrist, and say he's going to rebuild the Jewish temple and restart the sacrifices. But when you really look at that text, it doesn't say anything about the Antichrist, doesn't say anything about a rebuilt temple, doesn't say anything about a 7 years tribulation. This is all illusion based on a misinterpretation of Scripture, which is contrary to real biblical scholarship that's been going on for hundreds of years in the past from the Protestant reformers.